April 10th, 1241. The plains of Mohi, Kingdom of Hungary. King Bela IV surveyed his encampment from across the Sajo River with the confidence of a man commanding what was arguably the finest cavalry force in all of Europe. 100,000 men, they said, though modern historians suspect the number was closer to 50 or 60,000. Either way, it was an impressive sight. Knights in chainmail and plate armour, crossbowmen who had proven their worth in countless battles, infantry formations that stretched across the Hungarian plain. Below them, on the eastern bank of the Sajo, the Mongol advance guard probed his defences. 20,000 horsemen, perhaps 30,000 at most. Barrel-chested ponies that looked more suited to hauling carts than making war. Riders in lacquered leather armour that seemed almost primitive compared to the steel plate of Hungarian knights. To European eyes accustomed to the formidable heavy cavalry that dominated continental warfare, these Asiatic warriors appeared almost comical. Short bows that looked like toys, no shields, no lances for proper cavalry charges. What Bela didn't know, what none of the Hungarian commanders huddled in their wagon lager could have imagined, was that they were facing the greatest military mind of the 13th century, a 65-year-old Mongol general named Subutai who had spent 50 years perfecting the art of destroying armies. Within 24 hours, the Hungarian Royal Army, the pride of Central Europe, would cease to exist. The flower of Hungarian nobility would be dead, and the path to Vienna, to Paris, to the very heart of Christendom would lie open. This is the story of how one afternoon changed the course of European history, how steppe tactics obliterated feudal warfare, how 60,000 men learned that heavy armour meant nothing against arrows fired from 1,000 yards, and how close the Mongol Empire came to conquering all of Europe before a single event, completely unrelated to the battlefield, saved Western civilization. The Mongol invasion of Europe in 1241 was not a raid. It was not a reconnaissance mission. It was a carefully planned, methodically executed campaign of conquest that had been years in the making. The architect of this invasion was Subutai, though the nominal commander was Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan himself. Subutai had been born around 1175 to a family of blacksmiths and reindeer herders. Not nobility, not warriors, just common people from the forests north of the Mongolian steppe. What set Subutai apart was his mind. While other Mongol generals relied on courage and ferocity, Subutai approached warfare as a science. He studied terrain. He gathered intelligence months before campaigns began. He coordinated armies separated by hundreds of miles with a precision that wouldn't be matched in Europe until Napoleon. By 1241, Subutai had commanded over 20 major campaigns. He had conquered 32 nations, won 65 pitched battles, directed operations across more territory than Alexander, Hannibal and Caesar combined. When Ogedei Khan, Genghis's successor, ordered the invasion of Europe, there was never any question about who would plan it. The Mongol strategy for Europe was breathtaking in its ambition and complexity. 3 armies totaling 80,000 men would invade Hungary from different directions. A fourth force of 20,000 would strike Poland as a diversion, preventing Polish reinforcements from reaching the Hungarians. The armies would move independently, separated by hundreds of miles, destroying any opposition they encountered. Then they would converge on Hungary for the decisive battle. It was a plan that required perfect timing, flawless intelligence, and commanders capable of operating without direct supervision. European armies could barely coordinate forces 10 miles apart. Subutai was orchestrating a campaign across 500 miles. The first European forces to face the Mongols learned a terrible lesson. On April 9th, 1241, at Legnica in Poland, Duke Henry II the Pious assembled an army of 25 to 30,000 men. This was no rabble. Henry's forces included Teutonic Knights, Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, the finest heavy cavalry Christendom could produce, mounted warriors who had spent their entire lives training for war. Against them, the Mongol diversionary force under Princes Kadan and Baidar. 20,000 horsemen who looked like they couldn't possibly match European knights in open battle. The battle lasted less than an hour. The Mongols employed a tactic so simple, so devastating that European commanders had no answer for it. They retreated, not in panic, not in disorder. In perfect formation, horse archers firing backward from the saddle, maintaining precise intervals as they withdrew. The European knights charged. Of course they charged. It's what knights did. Heavy cavalry at full gallop was supposed to be an unstoppable force. The Mongols simply rode faster. Their smaller horses, bred for endurance rather than size, could maintain a sustained gallop for miles. The European war horses, carrying men in 60 pounds of armour plus their own armoured barding, could manage perhaps a quarter mile at full speed. As the knights tired, the Mongols turned, not all at once, in waves, companies of horse archers wheeling and firing, then retreating as the next wave took their place. European horses began to fall, not from direct hits necessarily. The Mongols were aiming for the horses, not the riders. A wounded horse meant a dismounted knight, and a knight on foot in 60 pounds of armour was effectively helpless. When the European formation broke, when gaps appeared in their lines, the Mongols sent in their lancers. Not for a prolonged melee, quick strikes at weak points, then withdrawal before the knights could regroup. Duke Henry tried to retreat. He was captured, killed, and beheaded. The Mongols collected ears from the fallen. It took 9 sacks to hold them all. The Battle of Lenica was a masterpiece of tactical execution, but it was also a diversion. The real target was Hungary, and there, Subutai had laid a trap that would make Legnica look like a skirmish. King Bela IV of Hungary was in a difficult position in early 1241. His kingdom was the last major power standing between the Mongols and Western Europe. He knew they were coming. The question was how to stop them. Hungary's strength was its heavy cavalry. Hungarian knights were considered among the best in Europe, descended from the Magyar horsemen who had terrorized the continent in the 9th and 10th centuries. But by the 13th century, the Hungarians had abandoned the light cavalry tactics of their ancestors in favour of European-style heavy cavalry. It was a decision that would cost them everything. Bela had other problems. His relationship with the Hungarian nobility was terrible. His father, King Andrew II, had given away so much royal land and privilege that the kingdom was nearly bankrupt. Bela had spent his reign trying to reclaim these donations, which made him deeply unpopular with the magnates whose support he needed. Then there were the Cumans, 40,000 Turkic nomads who had fled the Mongols and sought refuge in Hungary. Bela converted them to Christianity and gave them lands. The Cumans were light cavalry, experienced in fighting the Mongols. They should have been Bela's most valuable asset. Instead, they became his downfall. The Hungarian nobility hated the Cumans, resented their special treatment, despised these foreigners who refused to settle down and adopt Hungarian customs. When Bela called his forces to Pest in early April 1241, riots broke out. The Cuman Khan, who had been under Bela's personal protection, was murdered. Some historians believe Duke Frederick of Austria instigated this. Others suggest Mongol spies spread rumours that the Cumans were secretly allied with the invaders. Either way, the result was catastrophic. The Cumans, feeling betrayed, left Hungary, all 40,000 of them, pillaging as they went. Bela had lost the only force in his army with experience fighting Mongols. Many Hungarian magnates refused to join the muster. Some hoped that a defeat would humble the king and force him to restore their privileges. Others simply despised Bela enough that they preferred to see him fail. The army that marched north from Pest to confront the Mongols was large but fractious, poorly coordinated, led by nobles who distrusted each other and their king, and they were marching into a carefully prepared killing ground. Subutai had been gathering intelligence on Hungary for over a year. His spy network was legendary. Mongol scouts dressed as merchants had mapped every road, every ford, every mountain pass. They knew which cities had strong fortifications, which nobles were loyal to the king, where food and forage could be found. When Bela's army marched north, Subutai knew exactly where they were going. He withdrew, slowly, just fast enough to stay ahead of the Hungarians, not so fast that Bela would break off pursuit. He was drawing them to a battlefield of his choosing, the Sajo River near Mohi. It was perfect for Subutai's purposes. The river itself was a natural barrier, forcing any army crossing it to use the limited number of bridges and fords. The plain of Mohi was open ground, ideal for cavalry manoeuvres, and the woods on the eastern bank would hide Mongol positions from Hungarian scouts. Bela's army arrived at the Sajo on the evening of April 10th. They established a defensive position on the western bank near the single stone bridge that crossed the river. The Hungarian commanders ordered their army to form a wagon lega, a circular fortification of carts and wagons that would protect them from cavalry attacks. It was a standard defensive measure. Against European cavalry it was effective. Against the Mongols, It was a death trap. That night, as the Hungarians celebrated what they thought was their strong defensive position, Subutai prepared his attack. The Mongol force was divided into 3 groups. Batu Khan commanded the main force, which would assault the stone bridge directly. A northern contingent under Sejban would ford the river several miles upstream, then attack the bridge defenders from behind, and Subutai himself would lead the southern force. While the Hungarians were focused on the bridge, Subutai's engineers would build a pontoon bridge downstream. The timing had to be perfect. The bridge assault had to begin at dawn, when there was enough light to see but the Hungarians would still be disorganized from sleep. The flanking forces had to cross the river and get into position without being detected. And the final attack had to strike before the Hungarians could recover from the initial shock. It required coordination that European commanders considered impossible. Subutai had done it dozens of times. At around 4 in the morning on April 11, 1241, the northern Mongol force began crossing the river at a ford upstream. The water was cold, the current swift. But these were men who had crossed rivers in winter throughout their campaigns. A few miles of cold water was nothing. Around the same time, Subutai's engineers began constructing the pontoon bridge downstream. They worked in darkness, under constant arrow cover from Mongol archers positioned on the eastern bank. The Hungarians heard the commotion but couldn't see what was happening. At dawn, Batu Khan attacked the bridge. The Hungarian defenders, approximately 1,000 crossbowmen and knights, put up fierce resistance. Medieval crossbows were devastating weapons at close range. The Mongols who first attempted to cross the bridge took heavy casualties. It looked for a moment like the Hungarians might hold. Then Batu brought up his siege engines. 7. Stone-throwing catapults. Giant machines that the Mongols had learned to build from Chinese engineers. The Hungarians had never seen field artillery used this way. The catapults didn't target the bridge itself. They targeted the defenders. Stone projectiles weighing dozens of pounds arced over the river and crashed into the Hungarian positions. Crossbowmen were crushed. Knights were knocked from their horses. The organised defence disintegrated into chaos. Some historians believe the Mongols also used early gunpowder weapons at Mohi, incendiary devices, bombs filled with black powder and shrapnel. The evidence is debated, but multiple sources mention fire weapons and explosions. Whether gunpowder or just advanced incendiaries, the effect was the same: terror. The northern Mongol force arrived behind the bridge defenders around 8 in the morning. The Hungarians, caught between Batu's frontal assault and Sejban's attack from behind, broke. They retreated to their main camp to reform. This should have been where the Hungarians rallied, where their superior numbers told, where the wagon Lega gave them a defensive advantage. But Subutai had planned for this. The Mongol main force crossed the bridge and advanced on the Hungarian camp, not in a headlong charge, in disciplined formation, horse archers in front, heavy cavalry behind. They surrounded the wagon Lega on 3 sides. Then they began the killing. Mongol composite bows had an effective range of over 300 yards. Hungarian crossbows, for all their power, had a maximum effective range of perhaps 200 yards, and crossbows were slow to reload. A skilled crossbowman might manage 3 shots per minute. A Mongol horse archer could fire 10. The mathematics of this engagement were brutal. Thousands of Mongol archers positioned around the Hungarian camp, each firing constantly. Arrows fell like rain. They pierced chainmail. They found gaps in plate armour. They struck horses and men with equal efficiency. The Hungarians tried to charge out, to break through the encirclement and engage the Mongols in close combat, where European knights had the advantage. But every time they tried, they rode into that storm of arrows. Horses collapsed. Knights fell. Those who made it through the arrow barrage found that the Mongols simply withdrew, refusing close combat, continuing to fire as they retreated. Around mid-morning, Subutai's southern force arrived. The pontoon bridge had taken longer to build than planned. The river had been deeper than expected, but now 30,000 fresh Mongol warriors attacked the Hungarian rear. The Hungarians were surrounded, completely encircled, trapped in their own defensive position. This should have meant a fight to the death, a last stand where the outnumbered Mongols would take heavy casualties even in victory. But Subutai was too smart for that. He deliberately left a gap in the western side of the encirclement, an obvious escape route toward Pest. It looked like carelessness, a mistake. The Hungarians, desperate, took it. Thousands of men abandoned the camp and fled west. They thought they were escaping. They were wrong. The moment the Hungarian force began its retreat through the gap, it ceased being an army and became a mob. Discipline collapsed, units fragmented. Knights who had trained to fight in close formation found themselves isolated in a panicked crowd. That's when the Mongol pursuit began. Horse archers shadowed the fleeing Hungarians, not engaging directly, just firing constantly, picking off stragglers, targeting officers, creating more panic. The Hungarian columns stretched for miles. The road back to Pest became a killing field. Contemporary sources describe the horror. The ground turned red with blood. Bodies piled so high that later travellers had to find alternate routes. The pursuit continued for 60 miles. Most of the Hungarian army died in that retreat, not in glorious battle. Running, defenceless, shot down from behind, King Bela and his brother Koloman escaped, barely. Koloman was badly wounded and died soon after. Archbishop Ugrin was killed. Much of the Hungarian nobility died on that road. The Mongols collected ears again. This time, they needed more than 9 sacks. Modern estimates suggest the Hungarians lost 60,000 men at Mohi and in the subsequent pursuit. Some sources say it was the entire army. Recent scholarship puts the total closer to 40 or 50,000 dead. Either way, it was a catastrophe. In a single afternoon, Hungary lost most of its military strength. The kingdom's nobility was decimated. There was no organised force left capable of resisting the Mongols, and the Mongol losses, we don't know exactly, but they were significant. The Hungarian crossbowmen had inflicted real damage before the battle turned. Subutai's engineers had struggled with the pontoon bridge. Batu Khan himself had been in danger during the bridge assault. Some sources suggest the Mongols lost several thousand men. For them, that was a costly victory. But it was still a victory. Total, overwhelming, decisive. After Mohi, the Mongols ravaged Hungary. They burned Pest to the ground, massacring the inhabitants. They swept across the Hungarian plain, destroying everything in their path. Contemporary sources estimate that 1/4 of Hungary's population died in the invasion. In some lowland areas, entire populations were wiped out. The devastation was so complete that it would take Hungary decades to recover. King Bela fled to Croatia, then to the Adriatic coast, staying one step ahead of the Mongol pursuit. He sent desperate letters to other European powers, to the Pope, to the Holy Roman Emperor, to the King of France, begging for help against an enemy that stood within a week's ride of French borders. None responded. Some didn't believe the threat was real. Others thought Bela was exaggerating. Many were simply too caught up in their own internal conflicts to care what was happening in distant Hungary. Europe was saved not by military prowess or diplomatic intervention. Europe was saved by death. On December 11th, 1241 in Mongolia, Ögedei Khan died. He had been drinking heavily, probably had a heart attack or stroke. His death meant that all the princes of the blood had to return to Karakorum to elect a new great Khan. Batu Khan, despite Subutai's objections, ordered the withdrawal, not immediately. The Mongols spent most of 1242 consolidating their control of Hungary, but by spring they were gone. Retreating east across the plains, they had conquered. Europe breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the terrifying truth was that Europe had not won. They had been spared by chance, by the accidental death of a man 6,000 miles away. If Ögedei had lived another year, the Mongol armies would have continued west, and there was nothing to stop them. The Battle of Mohi revealed something that European military leaders didn't want to admit. Their entire system of warfare was obsolete. For centuries, European combat had been built around heavy cavalry, knights in armour, charging with lances, fighting in close formation. It was a system that emphasised individual valour, personal combat, and the feudal bonds between lord and vassal. The Mongols had made it irrelevant. Mongol warfare was based on completely different principles. Mobility over power, ranged combat over melee, coordination over individual heroism, deception over direct confrontation. European knights trained from childhood to fight hand-to-hand. Mongol warriors trained to avoid hand-to-hand combat whenever possible. Why risk your life in close combat when you could kill your enemy from 300 yards away? European armies moved slowly, constrained by their baggage trains and the need to forage. Mongol armies could cover 50 miles per day, living off their horses' milk and dried meat carried in their saddlebags. European commanders fought from the front, leading charges, demonstrating personal courage. Mongol commanders fought from hills, using flags and signals to direct their forces like pieces on a chessboard. The Mongol composite bow was a technological marvel that Europe couldn't match. Made from layers of horn, wood and sinew, it could fire arrows with enough force to pierce chainmail at 200 yards. In the hands of a warrior who had trained since childhood, it was accurate at 300 yards and could hit targets at 400. European crossbows were powerful but slow. Longbows, which wouldn't become common in England for another 50 years, required immense strength and years of training. The Mongol bow was superior to both, but the weapon itself wasn't the secret. It was how the Mongols used it. They didn't fire as individuals. They fired in volleys, thousands of archers shooting simultaneously at designated targets. The result was a continuous rain of arrows that no armor could fully withstand. Even if your armor stopped most arrows, eventually one would find a gap, would pierce your eye slit or the joint at your elbow or the back of your knee. And even if you survived, your horse probably wouldn't. A dead horse meant you were finished. The Mongol horse was the other critical advantage. Small by European standards, barrel-chested, tough. These animals could survive on grass that would starve European horses, could ford rivers that would drown larger breeds, could maintain a sustained trot for hours on end. Each Mongol warrior had multiple horses, typically 3 to 5, sometimes as many as 10 or 15 for long campaigns. They would rotate mounts throughout the day, always riding a fresh horse. This meant that even after hours of riding, Mongol cavalry were still mobile while their opponents were exhausted. The organization of Mongol armies was also revolutionary. They fought in decimal units, squads of 10, companies of 100, battalions of 1,000, divisions of 10,000. Each unit had a commander who was responsible for his men's performance. If a unit failed, the commander was executed. This created a level of discipline and accountability that European feudal armies couldn't match. Communications were handled through an elaborate system of flags, torches, and signals. Commanders could direct forces miles away with precision. If a flanking force was supposed to attack at noon, they attacked at noon. If they were supposed to regroup 10 miles south, they regrouped 10 miles south. European armies of the time couldn't coordinate anything that complex. And then there was intelligence. The Mongols maintained probably the most sophisticated espionage network in the medieval world. Before invading a region, they would send spies years in advance. Merchants, travellers, refugees, all gathering information. They knew the terrain, knew which cities were fortified, knew which nobles were loyal to their king and which could be bribed or intimidated, knew where food supplies were stored and where armies were likely to concentrate. By the time Subutai reached Hungary, he knew more about the kingdom than most Hungarian nobles did. The feudal system that dominated European warfare was particularly vulnerable to Mongol tactics. European armies weren't professional forces. They were coalitions of nobles, each bringing their own retainers. The quality and motivation of these forces varied wildly. Some nobles were skilled warriors leading trained men. Others were political appointments commanding peasants with minimal training. The Mongol military was meritocratic. Officers were promoted based on ability, not birth. Subutai himself was born to a family of blacksmiths. He rose to command because he won battles. In a European army, a man of such low birth would never have been given command. This meritocracy meant that Mongol armies were led by the most competent commanders, while European armies were often led by whoever had the right bloodline. After Mohi, European powers did begin to adapt. Hungary, having borne the brunt of the invasion, learned the hardest lessons. King Bela spent the rest of his reign fortifying his kingdom. He built stone castles throughout Hungary, not just royal fortresses, but allowing nobles to build their own fortified positions. The Mongols had proven that armies in the field were vulnerable. Stone walls might slow them down. Bela also reformed the Hungarian military, incorporating more light cavalry and archers. When the Golden Horde attempted a second invasion in 1285, they found a very different Hungary. The improved fortifications and more mobile Hungarian forces, led by Ladislaus IV, defeated the Mongol invasion in the hills of western Transylvania. Other European powers took note. Military theorists began studying Mongol tactics, the importance of mobility, the value of ranged combat, the need for better coordination between different units. But the full adoption of these lessons would take generations, and by then the Mongol Empire had fragmented, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. These successor states would never again coordinate the kind of massive invasion that Subutai had planned for Europe. The Battle of Mohi stands as one of the most one-sided victories in military history. 60,000 European soldiers destroyed in less than a day by a force half their size. But the significance goes beyond the casualty figures. Mohi demonstrated that the military system that had dominated Europe for centuries was vulnerable. That technological superiority, numerical advantage, and defensive positions meant nothing against an enemy that fought by completely different rules. It showed that warfare was evolving, that the age of the knight, for all its pageantry and romance, was already beginning to end. The mounted archer, the composite bow, the coordinated cavalry attack, these were the weapons of the future. It revealed the importance of intelligence and planning. Subutai didn't win at Mohi through courage or strength. He won through preparation, through understanding his enemy better than they understood themselves, through creating a situation where the outcome was determined before the battle even began. Most importantly, Mohi showed how close Europe came to conquest. The Mongols had destroyed every army they faced. They had proven they could defeat European forces at will. They had a clear path to Vienna, to Paris, to Rome itself. Only Ogedei's death saved Europe, and that raises a fascinating historical question. What if Ogedei hadn't died? What if the Mongol invasion had continued? Could they have conquered all of Europe? The answer, based on what we know, is probably yes. Not easily, not without cost, but yes. The Mongols had already demonstrated their ability to take fortified cities. They had Chinese siege engineers who could build the engines necessary to breach any wall. They had the logistics to maintain campaigns for years. They had defeated every military force Europe could field. Western Europe's geography might have slowed them down. More forests, more rivers, more castles and fortified cities than in the open plains of Hungary. The Atlantic Ocean would have been an impassable barrier. But everything from Vienna to the English Channel was potentially vulnerable. We'll never know because history took a different turn. The Mongol Empire fragmented. The Golden Horde controlled Russia but never again attempted a major invasion west. Kublai Khan focused on conquering China and Southeast Asia. The Ilkhanate fought Muslim armies in the Middle East. Europe, through no military achievement of its own, was spared. But the memory of 1241 lingered. For generations, Europeans spoke of the Mongol invasion with terror. They called it the Tatar Yoke, the Yellow Peril, the coming of the Antichrist. Matthew Paris, an English chronicler, wrote that people feared the Mongols would invade England next, that they were an unstoppable plague sent to punish Christendom for its sins. In Russia, the Mongol conquest was total and lasting. The Golden Horde ruled over the Russian principalities for over 2 centuries. Russian culture, military tactics, even language were influenced by this extended period of Mongol domination. In Hungary, the memory of Mohi shaped national identity. King Bela became known as the second founder of Hungary for his rebuilding efforts. The battle became a symbol of national trauma, a moment when the kingdom came within a hair's breadth of extinction. For military historians, Mohi stands alongside Cannae, Agincourt and Austerlitz as a masterpiece of tactical execution. Subutai's coordination of 3 separate forces, his use of feigned retreat and envelopment, his exploitation of terrain and weather, all represent warfare conducted at the highest level. Modern military academies still study the campaign. The principles of mobility, intelligence, and coordinated operations that Subutai employed are as relevant today as they were in 1241. Some historians argue that Subutai was the greatest military commander in history, greater than Alexander, who conquered a smaller area against less sophisticated opponents, greater than Caesar, who wrote his own histories to inflate his achievements, greater than Napoleon, whose campaigns ended in defeat. Subutai won more battles against more diverse opponents across more terrain than any other general in recorded history, and he did it while commanding armies of horsemen against enemies equipped with steel, crossbows, and stone fortifications. Others argue that Subutai's success was as much about Mongol military culture as individual genius, that any competent Mongol commander with those resources would have achieved similar results. That comparing him to generals from different eras with different technology isn't meaningful. Both perspectives have merit. What's undeniable is that on April 11, 1241, on the plains of Mohi, the largest and most powerful army in Central Europe was annihilated in a single afternoon. That 60,000 men marched out confident in their strength and their armour and their horses. And by sunset, most of them were dead. That the survivors fled not as an army but as a mob. That Europe's military elite learned that everything they thought they knew about warfare was wrong. And that only the death of a Mongol Khan thousands of miles away prevented the conquest of Western Europe. The Hungarians had arrayed the finest cavalry in Europe against Subbutai's forces. They had superior numbers. They held a defensive position. They fought with the courage and skill that had made European knights legendary. None of it mattered. Because Subbutai had already won the battle through planning and preparation. The actual fighting was just confirming what his intelligence and tactics had already determined. When historians speak of the Mongol invasion of Europe, they often focus on the grand strategy, the massive scale of the operation, the coordination across thousands of miles. All of that is important. But at its core, the invasion succeeded because on a specific day, at a specific place, a Mongol general named Subbutai demonstrated that he understood warfare better than anyone else alive. King Bela fled. His brother died. His nobility was slaughtered. His kingdom was ravaged. And Europe, for the first and only time in the High Middle Ages, faced the very real possibility of complete conquest by a power from beyond its borders. The Battle of Mohi was not just a military defeat. It was a revelation. A moment when the old order of European warfare was exposed as obsolete. When the mounted knight, symbol of medieval military power, proved helpless against an enemy that refused to fight on European terms. In the decades that followed, Europe would slowly adapt, would begin incorporating some of the lessons Mohi had taught. But in 1241, on that blood-soaked field along the Sarjo River, there were only two truths. The Mongols had crushed the largest army in Europe in a single afternoon, and if Ogedei Khan had lived another year, the history of Western civilization would have been written in Mongolian. The legacy of Mohi extended far beyond the immediate devastation. In the months following the battle, as the Mongols methodically destroyed what remained of organized resistance in Hungary, the full scope of their military superiority became apparent. They weren't just better at fighting, they had developed an entirely different paradigm of warfare that rendered European military doctrine nearly irrelevant. Consider the logistics. A typical European army of 50,000 men required hundreds of supply wagons, blacksmiths to repair armour and weapons, cooks to prepare food, servants to attend to the nobles, a baggage train that stretched for miles and moved at a crawl. The army had to follow roads, had to stop at towns and castles to resupply, could only campaign during certain seasons when food was available. The Mongols? They travelled with almost no baggage. Each warrior carried dried meat and curdled milk in leather sacks. They drank their horses' blood when necessary, making small incisions in the neck veins that would heal within days. They could cross terrain that European armies considered impassable, could campaign in winter when their opponents thought fighting impossible, could maintain operations for months in enemy territory without supply lines. This logistical superiority meant that European commanders never knew where the Mongols would strike next. After Mohi, Mongol columns ranged across Hungary, destroying towns and fortifications. One force would appear near Zagreb, another would attack settlements along the Danube, a third would raid deep into Croatia. European observers thought they were facing a massive army. Actually, they were facing multiple independent columns, each numbering perhaps 5,000 to 10,000 men, operating with complete autonomy but coordinated purpose. The psychological impact was devastating. Medieval warfare had rules, understood by all participants. Armies met on agreed battlefields. Sieges followed established protocols. Ransoms were paid for captured nobles. There was a certain predictability, almost a ritualized quality, to European combat. The Mongols ignored all of it. They didn't ransom nobles, they executed them. They didn't follow rules of siege warfare. They used Chinese engineers to build siege towers and catapults that could breach walls thought impregnable. They didn't respect safe conducts or diplomatic immunity. When the Duke of Austria tried to negotiate, Mongol envoys smiled and took notes about his fortifications. Cities that resisted were annihilated, not just conquered, destroyed so completely that they ceased to exist. Pest, one of the great cities of Hungary, was razed to the ground. Contemporary sources describe streets filled with corpses, buildings torn apart stone by stone. The surviving population driven into the countryside to starve. Cities that surrendered immediately were sometimes spared. Sometimes. The Mongols used terror as a weapon. Survivors from destroyed cities would flee to neighbouring settlements, spreading stories of Mongol atrocities. When the Mongols arrived at the next city, the defenders often surrendered without a fight. Psychological warfare on a scale Europe had never experienced. King Bela, hiding on the Adriatic coast, sent increasingly desperate messages to other European powers. His letters to Pope Gregory IX are still preserved in Vatican archives. They make for grim reading. Bela described Hungary as a wasteland, described bodies piled so high they blocked roads, described Mongol warriors who seemed superhuman in their endurance and skill. He warned that Hungary was just the beginning, that the Mongols had destroyed Poland and Hungary in the same campaign, that no European army could stand against them, that Western Europe would be next. The Pope issued a call for a crusade, not against Muslims in the Holy Land, against the Mongol threat. The response was underwhelming. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II was excommunicated and fighting his own wars in Italy. The French King Louis IX was dealing with internal rebellions. The English King Henry III was locked in conflict with his barons. None of them truly understood the threat. How could they? Medieval Europe had no concept of an enemy like the Mongols. They had fought Muslims during the Crusades, but those were familiar enemies. Warriors who fought with similar weapons and tactics, who held territory and could be negotiated with, who operated within a framework of rules that both sides understood. The Mongols were alien. They appeared from the east like a force of nature. They destroyed everything they encountered. They moved faster than messengers could carry news. They won every battle through tactics that seemed like sorcery to European observers. Duke Frederick II of Austria saw an opportunity in Hungary's weakness. While Bela was fleeing from the Mongols, Frederick invaded western Hungary and seized several border territories. This would have long-lasting consequences. Hungarian-Austrian relations remained poisoned for generations. But in the moment, it demonstrated how little European powers understood what they were facing. Frederick thought he was taking advantage of a neighbour's temporary weakness. He didn't realise he was stealing furniture from a house that was burning down. If the Mongols had continued their invasion, Austria would have been the next target. Frederick's opportunistic land grab would have meant nothing. But the Mongols didn't continue. Through the summer and fall of 1241, they consolidated their control over Hungary. They built winter quarters. They prepared for the next phase of the campaign. Subutai had already been studying maps of Austria and Bavaria. He knew which passes through the Alps could be crossed, knew where the major cities were, knew which rivers could be forded, and which would require bridges. The invasion plan for Western Europe was probably similar to the Hungary campaign, multiple columns advancing simultaneously. One force through Austria toward Vienna, another through Croatia toward Venice, perhaps a third up the Danube toward Bavaria. The columns would destroy any opposition they encountered, then converge on a central target. Probably Vienna or possibly Prague. After that, the Rhine Valley would be next, the wealthy cities of northern Italy, perhaps an advance through France toward the English Channel. The Mongols had conquered empires stretching from Korea to Poland. Adding Western Europe to that domain would have been ambitious, but not impossible. European geography might have provided some advantages the open plains of Hungary had not. The Alps would slow any invasion. The dense forests of Germany were harder to navigate than steppe grasslands. The castle-building boom of the High Middle Ages meant there were fortified positions everywhere, but fortifications had not saved Hungary. The Mongols had Chinese siege engineers who understood counterweights, traction trebuchets, and mining techniques. They had successfully besieged cities in China, Persia, and Russia. European castles of the 1240s, impressive as they were, would not have stopped them indefinitely. The deeper problem for Europe was coordination, or rather, the complete lack of it. After Mohi, the Pope called for unity against the Mongol threat. The response demonstrated exactly why Europe was vulnerable. The Holy Roman Empire was fractured into dozens of semi-independent principalities. Italy was divided between papal and imperial factions. France and England were traditional enemies. Spain was occupied with the Reconquista against Muslim kingdoms. The Mongols, by contrast, operated with unified command. When Genghis Khan ordered the invasion of Europe, all Mongol forces moved in concert. Armies separated by hundreds of miles coordinated their operations with precision. Commanders who disagreed with strategy still followed orders. The contrast with European military organisation could not have been more stark. In December 1241, when news of Ogedai's death reached the Mongol armies in Hungary, the campaign was in full preparation for spring. Supplies were stockpiled, bridges were being built across Hungarian rivers to facilitate troop movements. The vanguard had already begun probing raids into Austria. Batu Khan, the nominal commander of the European invasion, received the news and faced a decision. Mongol law required that all princes of the blood return to Karakorum for the Kurultai, the great assembly that would elect the next great Khan. Batu himself was a potential candidate. His rivals would certainly return immediately. Subutai reportedly argued for continuing the campaign. The military situation was perfect. Europe was defenceless. Another campaigning season would secure Austria and perhaps Bavaria. They could deal with the succession afterward. But Batu's political position was uncertain. He was Genghis Khan's grandson, but there were other grandsons with stronger claims. If he remained in Europe while his rivals secured power in Karakorum, he might return to find himself marginalised or worse. The decision to withdraw was political, not military. The Mongol forces began their retreat in early 1242. They didn't hurry. They spent weeks systematically destroying what remained of Hungarian infrastructure, burning crops, demolishing fortifications, ensuring that Hungary would not recover quickly. By spring of 1242, the Mongol armies had withdrawn across the Carpathian Mountains back into the steppes they had come from. They left behind a Hungary so devastated that contemporary sources claimed 1/4 to 1/2 of the population had died. Archaeological evidence supports these horrific figures. Settlement patterns disappeared. Whole regions were depopulated. Hungary's economy collapsed. King Bela emerged from hiding to survey the ruins of his kingdom. He spent the rest of his reign, nearly 30 more years, rebuilding. The fortification program he initiated transformed Hungary. Before 1241, Hungary had perhaps 20 stone castles. By Bela's death in 1270, there were hundreds. Every noble family of significance built fortified residences. Towns erected walls. The entire kingdom became a network of strongpoints. This military architecture was explicitly designed to counter Mongol tactics. Since Hungarian armies in open battle had proven helpless, the strategy became defensive. Mongol forces might sweep across the countryside, but they would eventually encounter fortified positions that would slow them down. Given enough time, relief forces could be assembled. The mobile warfare that had destroyed Hungary at Mohi could be blunted by stone walls. The strategy worked. When the Golden Horde under Nogai Khan invaded Hungary again in 1285, they found a very different situation. King Ladislaus IV used the fortification network to avoid decisive battle. Mongol forces besieged several castles, but lacked the siege equipment that Subutai's armies had possessed. When Hungarian forces finally engaged the Mongols in the hills of Transylvania, the terrain neutralised Mongol mobility advantages. The invasion failed. Other European powers learned similar lessons, though more slowly. The importance of fortifications, the value of mobile forces, the need for better military coordination. But the full revolution in European warfare would take centuries. England eventually developed the longbow, which provided some of the range advantages Mongol composite bows had offered. The longbow's effectiveness at Crécy in 1346 and Agincourt in 1415 demonstrated that massed archery could devastate heavy cavalry. Though it's worth noting that longbows required years of training and immense physical strength, every male archer in England was legally required to practice regularly. Even then, English longbowmen could not match the rate of fire or accuracy of Mongol horse archers. Gunpowder weapons, which the Mongols had encountered in China and possibly used at Mohi, would eventually transform European warfare completely. By the 15th century, cannon could breach any wall. By the 16th century, handheld firearms were replacing bows and crossbows. The age of heavy cavalry that the Mongols had made obsolete would truly end. But in 1241, none of these developments had occurred. Europe's military system remained fundamentally medieval, built around feudal obligations and knightly combat, valuing individual valour over tactical coordination, emphasising honour and courage over efficiency and effectiveness. The Mongol Empire, had it continued, westward, would have imposed a very different order on Europe. We can look at Russia for a preview of what that might have meant. The Golden Horde ruled over the Russian principalities for over 200 years. Russian princes had to travel to Sarai, the Mongol capital on the Volga, to receive permission to rule. Russian armies adopted Mongol tactics and equipment. Russian culture absorbed Mongol influences in everything from military organization to postal systems. Some historians argue this period of Mongol rule fundamentally shaped Russian development, created an autocratic tradition that persisted long after Mongol power faded, isolated Russia from Western European cultural and technological developments. Others contend that Mongol influence has been overstated, that Russian culture retained its essential character despite the political subjugation. Either way, the contrast is clear. Russia experienced 2 centuries of Mongol domination. Western Europe experienced a single year of Mongol invasion that ended due to political circumstances 6,000 miles away. That difference shaped the next 7 centuries of European history. Imagine if Ögedei had lived another 5 years. The Mongol forces would have continued their advance. Vienna would likely have fallen by 1243. The fractured Holy Roman Empire would have proven unable to coordinate an effective defence. Mongol columns would have advanced down the Danube and up through Italy. Would they have conquered all of Western Europe? Probably not. The Atlantic Ocean provided a natural boundary. The British Isles would have been safe. Scandinavian kingdoms protected by distance and sea would have survived. Perhaps France west of the Loire River would have remained independent. Spain, occupied with its own conflicts, might have been spared initially. But the core of medieval Europe, the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, northern Italy, the wealthy trading cities of the Low Countries, all of this would have been vulnerable. The cultural and economic heartland of medieval Christendom would have come under Mongol dominion. The consequences would have been staggering. No Renaissance as we know it, since the Italian city-states that fostered it would have been under Mongol control or destroyed. No rise of nation-states in Germany, since the region would have been subordinate to Mongol Khans. No development of parliamentary institutions in Central Europe. No Protestant Reformation, since the religious and political structures that enabled it wouldn't exist. Western civilization as we understand it might never have developed. Or perhaps it would have emerged in different forms, blending European and Mongol elements. We have no way of knowing. History does not run experiments. What we do know is that on April 11, 1241, at the Battle of Mohi, the course of world history pivoted on the outcome of a single afternoon's fighting. 60,000 Hungarian soldiers faced 30 to 40,000 Mongol warriors. The Hungarians had superior numbers, better defensive positions, heavier armour, and were fighting on their own territory. They should have, by every conventional military calculation, won. They didn't. They were annihilated, destroyed so completely that organised resistance in Hungary effectively ceased to exist. The Mongol military system, based on mobility, archery, coordination and intelligence, proved superior to the European feudal system in every meaningful way. Subutai, the 65-year-old general who planned and executed the battle, demonstrated a level of tactical and strategic sophistication that Europe would not match for centuries. His coordination of multiple columns, his use of terrain and weather, his psychological manipulation of enemy forces, his integration of different military capabilities into a unified operational plan, all of this represented warfare conducted at the highest possible level. He understood something that European commanders did not. That warfare was not about courage or honour, or individual combat prowess. It was about creating situations where your enemy could not win regardless of how bravely they fought, about identifying weaknesses in enemy doctrine and exploiting them ruthlessly, about preparation and intelligence and the patient construction of victory long before the first arrow was fired. The Hungarian knights who charged the Mongol lines at Mohi were brave. They were skilled warriors who had trained their entire lives for battle. They died not because they lacked courage, but because they were fighting an enemy that had evolved beyond the medieval European understanding of warfare. Their sacrifice, their destruction, served as a warning that Europe would not fully heed for generations. That the military system which had dominated the continent since the fall of Rome was becoming obsolete. That new forms of warfare were emerging that rendered obsolete all the certainties about heavy cavalry and feudal armies and knightly valour. But that warning was delivered by an invasion that then mysteriously vanished. The Mongols withdrew, Europe was spared, and in the absence of continued pressure, the lessons of Mohi were gradually forgotten or misunderstood. Hungary remembered. Hungary built castles and reformed its military and never forgot how close the kingdom had come to extinction. But France, England, the Italian states, for them, the Mongol invasion became a distant horror story, something that had happened to someone else, somewhere else, not a warning about their own vulnerability. It would take European powers centuries to develop military systems that incorporated the lessons Mohi had offered: professional standing armies, coordinated command structures, intelligence gathering, mobile artillery, combined arms tactics. All of these eventually emerged in Europe, but slowly, gradually, through hard experience rather than sudden revelation. The Battle of Mohi stands as one of history's great what-ifs. What if Genghis Khan had not died when he did? What if the Mongol invasion had continued? What if Subutai had been allowed to complete his conquest of Europe? We'll never know. History took a different path. The Mongol Empire fragmented into squabbling khanatans. Europe recovered and eventually flourished. The terrifying warriors who had seemed unstoppable in 1241 became a historical footnote for most Europeans. But for one day, on a blood-soaked plain in Hungary, the future of Western civilization hung in the balance. 60,000 men learned that everything they knew about warfare was wrong. And Europe discovered, too late for those who died but just in time for those who survived, that the world was larger and more dangerous than they had imagined. Subutai returned east with his armies. He would never again campaign in Europe. The greatest general of the medieval period, perhaps the greatest general in history, had demonstrated his mastery one final time. The victory was total. The tactical execution was perfect. The strategic implications were staggering. And then, because of events completely beyond his control, he had to abandon his conquest and ride east to attend a political assembly 6,000 miles away. The plains of Mohi returned to grass. The bodies were buried or scavenged by wolves. The Hungarian survivors rebuilt their destroyed lives. And Western Europe, spared by accident rather than achievement, continued its development toward modernity, never quite realizing how close it had come to a completely different fate.